Hello again. I'm Dr. Jordan Taylor, undergraduate exercise science program director and associate teaching professor at the University of Kansas. On today's episode of Fitness Facts, I have Dr. Quincy Johnson back in studio to talk about some of his football sports science research that he has published. Specifically, we will discuss how the physical characteristics of NCAA Division I offensive and defensive linemen have changed over 8 decades. There's no doubt that the athletic prowess of football players, including linemen, has increased over time. We will explore why football players are bigger, faster, and stronger than ever, and how the mass and speed of current players affects on-field performance and injury risk. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Sport, and Exercise Sciences at the University of Kansas, and he's a member of the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Laboratory. He received his bachelor's degree in exercise science from Midland University and his master's and doctoral degrees in health and human performance from Oklahoma State University. Dr. Johnson's research interests focus on optimizing athletic performance, developing physiological profiles to support training and return to play approaches, long-term athletic development, and training load monitoring. These interests have led to professional roles within high school, collegiate, professional, and private athletic settings. In addition to his scholarly activity, Dr. Johnson has been an active strength coach, working with athletes from professional to peewee levels of sport. Most recently, he served as the Director of Loper Performance at the University of Nebraska-Kearney and the Director of Strength and Conditioning at Kearney Combat Sports. Dr. Johnson is an active member of the National Strength and Conditioning Association and American College of Sports Medicine. He holds certifications from the NSCA as a Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist with distinction, a certified personal trainer with distinction. He also holds certifications through USA Weightlifting, Functional Movement Systems, and the International Society of Performance Analysis of Sport. Additionally, he serves as the vice chair of the NSCA's Powerlifting Special Interest Group, and he is on the board of directors for the International Association of Strength and Conditioning. That's a mouthful. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
Glad to be back.
All right. So before I guess we get into like the meat and potatoes, you're a Midwest guy, right? So you like meat and potatoes. Before we get into the meat and potatoes discussion, just kind of talk about, what you're interested in researching in the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab, and then why is conducting football sports science research of interest to you?
Well, thanks for having me on again. My research interests are in developing physical fitness profiles for athletes. So that's kind of one part of it, but also looking at the long-term athletic development of athletes. So how do athletes develop over time, whether it be through strength and conditioning or sports-specific development? And then also, how does that contribute to optimal athletic performance? So in my mind, I think of layers, kind of mentioned on the previous episode. So whenever we're doing these physiological profiles of the athlete, can we assess, quantitatively their health, well-being? Can we also assess their body composition, movement capacity, strength, power, speed, sport-specific performance to better understand how they perform and how we can develop and how we can achieve optimal outcomes? And then for the second part of your question, what interests me?
Science.
Football sports science. So similar to you, I have a background playing sports, playing football specifically. Started playing football when I was 5 or 6 years old, played throughout college, and I've always wondered, especially in college, like, man, fall camp, those first 3 days, they're putting us through the ringer. Is that just my body, or is it something different? So I started to think about the demands of the sport, how my body was adapting.
Mm-hmm.
Then like, okay, middle of the camp, I feel good. And then end of the camp, the last 2 days are a grind too. So that's kind of, that sparked my interest in football research.
I relate to that totally, because it's like you're a jock, but you're also a science nerd.
Yeah.
So the science side starts kicking in while you're out there. You start thinking about all these things. And so, that makes sense why you'd want to do research in the area. So, and you got to, obviously, you know how it is as a researcher. You got to research stuff you're interested in.
Exactly.
Or you're not going to put in the amount of time it takes to publish these articles if you don't like what you're researching, right? So, I guess we'll dive right in now into today's topic and discuss the paper you wrote. And we see this picture here, this first picture that was published in 2022 in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, and it's titled Kinanthropometric. That is a tongue twister. Should I say it again? Kinanthropometric. characteristic comparisons of NCAA Division I offensive and defensive linemen spanning 8 decades, right? So it's a long time. I mean, 80 years looking at changes that have happened and occurred to collegiate football players at the D1 level at specific positions, offensive and defensive linemen. And you can see there your name's highlighted. Now, this was some work that you did back when you were at Oklahoma State. And of course, now you're at University of Kansas. But can you explain, I guess the first question is, people are going to wonder, well, what does Kinanthropometric mean?
Right. So Kinanthropometric combines kinesiology and anthropometrics, right? So we take into account measurements of body size, shape, composition, right? So not only just stature, like your height, not only just body mass, like your weight, but also maybe muscle mass, lean body mass, fat mass. And we also look at the relationship between that and movement variables such as sprinting, jumping, jogging, change of direction.
Gotcha. Understand. Well, then I guess, can you provide some background information on this paper? Maybe just summarize the introduction of it. So, one of the things I talked about in my notes here is that, current athletes are physically and physiologically superior to those of the past. I mean, you can see it. You go back and watch old footage. I mean, the athletes today, it's just crazy. And there's been a lot of advancements in the field of sports science, exercise science, understanding how to train and why you're training a certain way, advances in nutrition and supplementation, all this research. But, you look at it like, and you have it in your introduction here, for instance, the world record time for the men's 100-meter sprint back in 1912. Were they even running 100 meters back there? It was 100 yard. I think it would have been 100 yard.
100 yard?
Yeah, which is less than 100 meters. It was only 10.6 seconds.
Yeah.
The current world record now, they run 100 meters, right, is obviously Usain Bolt.
Right.
At 9.58 seconds, a full 1.8 seconds faster if you look at the current world record versus, back in the early 1900s. Other examples here you had stated in the intro of this article, for field events, the male mile run. Let's look at that. The male mile run time in 1913 was 4 minutes, 14 seconds. Compared with the current world record is 3 minutes, 43.3 seconds, right? That's a big difference there. Over 30 seconds difference in the male run time or male mile run time. And then you look at field events in 1900, the shot put record was 13.8 meters by Robert Garrett, who was 6'2" and weighed 179 pounds, compared with the current record of 23.12 meters. So that's getting close. It's not quite double, but almost double.
Almost double.
Held by Randy Barnes, who stands 6'4.5" and 291 pounds, right? So, again, just examples of how athletic prowess of different athletes, not just in football, but you look at track and field, it's just advanced over time. So, and I guess if we get into the sport of football, you look at the first college football game was played back in 1869. A lot of people may not realize that, but how has the game changed and evolved over time? I mean, we could do a whole episode on this, but I just briefly, what has changed since that first college football game in 1869 to the current edition we all love to watch today or play?
Right. And that's kind of the introduction is pretty much trying to highlight just differences in how much athletes have changed, sports have changed, and then specifically football has changed, right?
Yeah.
So not only, I think the most obvious rules, regulations, right? Standard of play, the equipment available to the athletes, the amount of resources available to organizations. It doesn't even have to be professional. It could be youth athletes. Right. They have many more resources available to educate coaches, right?
Yeah.
To support their practice approach, training approach, etc. And then also things that have advanced since then, competition, preparation strategy, right? Those approaches and the way the game is played used to be under center, right?
Right.
Used to be a lot of run right between the tackles, run right at you. Now we see a lot more spread type offense. So
throwing the ball 40, 50, 60 times a game. Even more.
So the game's evolved.
rules have changed, equipment has changed.
Right.
I mean,
lighter shoulder pads, helmets.
I even look at, and even us, like when I had my junior college scholarship, that would have been 1999. You look at a helmet from like the late 90s, even to the early 2000s, a steel face mask, they were heavier.
Yeah.
Then they went to titanium. The helmets are a lot lighter. I mean, just the way they're designed.
Yeah.
I mean, the pads are just almost molded to your body.
Yeah.
I think about, you go back, watch old like 80s or 1970s NFL films or 1980s NFL
pads
films.
Are like this big.
Huge pads, the neck roll. You got pads on the forearms. I mean, these guys have pads everywhere. Now, I know me as a skill position guy, as like little slot receiver and kick and punt returner, I wanted less pads. I didn't like having, a big, heavy, bulky knee and thigh pads and big, bulky shoulder pads. It's like, I want to stay light and fast. And so, there's just been so many changes there with the equipment, the rule changes, the training approaches. It used to be, you think of coaches, even one of my old arena football coaches, Coach Cortez, old school Italian guy, he played at the University of Colorado back in, I believe it was the 60s, played against Gale Sayers when Gale Sayers was here at KU. He even jokingly told me one day, he's like, I tackled Gale Sayers and told him, you're nothing, It's like, so Coach Cortez, if you're out there, old school, love that coach. But old school, no nonsense. And he used to say, I was playing arena football and we were training. He's like, it used to be in the 60s and 70s, they were worried about you getting too muscular, doing too much in the weight room. Like, that's going to impair your athletic performance. And of course, that's another way that training for football has advanced, is like, no, like, it's a year-round sport now. You're training in season. You're training off season.
Right.
You're working in the weight room and you're doing your agility and your plyometric work. And that it's a year-round approach. And they used to be worried about that, in the 60s and 70s, getting too big. And you just look at that gets into kind of the next point here is why are football players today bigger, faster, stronger, and more powerful than in years past? I mean, you look at a lineman from the 70s or 80s, might be 250, 280. There weren't linemen that were over 300 pounds.
No.
I mean, you're seeing this now at big 5A, 6A high schools.
Yeah.
In junior college, at NAIA, D2, D1 levels, of course, the offensive linemen, they're all over 300 pounds.
Right.
I mean, and it wasn't that way in the NFL in the 70s and 80s. It was very rare to see players that size. And not only are they big, they can move, right? There's one thing if you're big, but it's like, can you move that weight? What's your composition? Is that fat weight, muscle weight?
Right.
Are you explosive?
Right.
And a lot of times the answer is like, yeah, these linemen, they're moving.
They can move. They can run block. They can pass it. They can get out in space and run. That's my favorite part, just watching football. Maybe there's a screen and the lineman is running downfield and they're opening up, striding, and they're blocking an open space, right, against a skill position like a safety.
Yeah. It's amazing how athletic these linemen have gotten. I mean, it really is. I mean, they're big, but they can move that weight around.
Right.
Yeah, it's wild. And then why do you think some of this we kind of talked about, but why?
Sure. Just our understanding, right, of the sport, of the demands, the change in the strategy of football, right? To where it used to be so run heavy, run dominant between the tackles, where we need to grind, to now let's spread them out. Let's run. Let's get our guys, our fast guys like you, right, out into space and let you make a move. So it's changed a lot. So we understand the demands, we understand the change in strategy, but also access to those resources like qualified nutritionists, dietitians, strength conditioning professionals, sports medicine professionals, where we can keep those athletes healthy, training. So we see from my perspective, a combination of all these things contribute to bigger, faster, stronger offensive linemen, defensive linemen.
And it's amazing the developments in exercise and sports science. Like, it's evidence-based. Like, there's research out there that's done in labs like the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab to find, what is the best way to go about training so that you optimize and maximize athletic performance, whether it's a football player, a lineman, or other positions, or a sport. And if you look at the sport of football, there's different demands at each position, right?
Yep.
I mean, the demands and what's going to be asked of a receiver or running back are going to be different than say a lineman, but there's still some crossover there in what's going to be asked of them. So yeah, I think just that understanding and understanding how to train and what the purpose of it is obviously, that has advanced big time.
Right.
So maybe anything else you want to add there before we get into like the purpose of your study?
No, not really. That's pretty much.
So let's just talk about what the purpose of the study is. So we'll bring up picture 2 here, and we'll take a look at. I think this should be what was in the abstract here. So I have highlighted there. If you just want to maybe read through that cover, what's the primary purpose of your study here?
Well, sure, yeah. Primary purpose for this study was to compare body mass and stature of offensive line and defensive line for each decade since 1950, and to subsequently compare speed using more recently available NFL combine data to determine if the rates of gain have been consistent or is waning. And so essentially, to reduce that, we're pretty much looking at those Kinanthropometrics and looking at those changes over the decades to see, okay, wow. So are there significant differences between decades, when and where? And then let's see if there's a significant rate of change in the body mass between decades.
Right. So you can see if there is changes, and then it's to getting to, well, why? Why are these changes happening?
And is it a trend? And if it is, then that helps us, like as a practitioner or researcher, prepare, stay proactive, like, okay, this is where the game is headed, right? How can we better prepare our athletes?
Right. And everything in football, the sport of football, it's so cyclical. You know, it's like, I've always told people, you know, like you mentioned now, it's such it's so pass oriented. Like I said, throwing 40, 50, 60 times a game. There's less emphasis on the running game. You know, the type of players that are out there, they look different, they move different.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like at some point it may go back to that run-oriented power game.
Right.
Because, you know, as you see more of these smaller, quick players, like I'm thinking even skill positions. But, you know, I think at some point, you put a bunch of smaller, quick, fast guys out on defense. Offensive-minded coaches think, well, no, let's get players bigger, like old Nebraska back in the 80s or something.
Mm-hmm.
Get them bigger and run power.
Right.
And it's like bigger players, you know, going up against these smaller, quicker athletes. Everything's just cyclical. It's like what's in, what's the flavor of the month or the flavor of the year. It can change very quickly back in, you know, several years' time from now. So,
and, you know, I think about football too, just from playing experience. I heard coaches say all the time, and it kind of comes back to this study that football, the game starts up front with your O-line, your D-line. So it starts with the hogs and the trenches, right? And then number 2, run the ball. Like, you have to establish a run game. You talk to a lot of offensive coordinators, it's like we have to establish a run early, often. Right. And even there have been some talks from analysts that say, well, this team didn't establish a run early enough in the season, so it's going to be tougher for them later on, game plan, scheme-wise.
And that's what I was saying. You see it, some of these coaches, they're putting the smaller, quicker, faster athletes out there to cover turf, but then they go up against a bigger team that's run-oriented. They're going to be worn. They could be worn out. And this is where some of those kinanthropometric measurements and the characteristics of the athletes that are out there on the field, it can have an impact on the outcome of the game.
Right, exactly.
And then now you're tracking these trends over decades and over time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, coaches could use that information, right, to maybe alter training in the off season. Maybe we need to bulk our players up, or maybe we need to work on other components, right? So you see how that's where sports science and getting this information out to coaches, but then also working with the coaches and listening to them. Because it's not like us as exercise or sports scientists, we don't know everything. We want to listen to the coaches too, because they're working with the athletes every day. So it's building that two-way bridge.
Exactly.
So that you maximize
communication.
Yeah. Well, I think we hammered the purpose. Let's get into the results of the research. So let's pull up picture 3 here. So from the study, if I flip over, so picture 3 is this figure 1. So maybe talk about this figure.
Well, sure. So this is a figure for pretty much weight for offensive linemen, which is that bold black line. Over the decades, then defensive lineman, which is that dash line over the decades. So we can kind of see just visually there's a trend from the 50s to the 80s where it's pretty similar, right? O-line versus D-line. And then from the 80s to the 90s, there's a spike, right? Seems to be a larger spike for the offensive line compared to defensive line. And then they keep increasing throughout the remaining decades. Something interesting here to point out is like offensive linemen, back in the 50s, 60s on average, they might have weighed 195, 196 pounds.
I just calculated it. That's why I pulled my phone out. I had to pull up the calculator. I'm laughing because I was like, well, the y-axis is in kilograms.
Yeah.
You know, everybody, like, this is America, so they're going to be like, what is that in kilograms? So if you just multiply 90 by 2.2, you get weight in pounds. So back in the 50s, your O lineman, D lineman were about 100, like you said, 198 pounds is what I got, 195.
Yeah.
Because 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. And then if we look at 2020, let me multiply that out. So we're up at, for the O lineman, 140, times 2.2, 308 pounds, average size for an NCAA Division I lineman.
Division I, Power 5, and this is just average, right? And so, as we can see, right, visually, there are changes, there are increases in body mass, likely due to a better understanding, again, of the sport, change in tactic strategy, improved nutritional dietitian or dietetic support as well. But this also raises other questions I'm sure we'll get to later on, just like, okay, so by increasing body mass, how much more force do these athletes produce? How fast do these athletes run? How much momentum do these athletes produce? That's what I was going to say.
Momentum is mass times velocity. So if they're bigger and they're moving faster and you're colliding, there's more momentum.
So the game is evolving. And, of course, from the health, wellness, safety standpoint, I know the NCAA they have a mission targeted towards that, but also the NFL, even at the higher level. So it's always a topic in our minds, the research side.
And it'd be interesting to tease this out too, because again, this is mass in kilograms, or like I said, you multiply it by 2.2, you get mass in pounds. So the weight and the mass of the players has went up. And then it's like, then I think it's the sports scientist or exercise scientist in me. It's like, well, what is this weight comprised of? What is the tissue? Have they put on, is this mostly muscle? Is it fat? You know, the weight has went up, but now it's like, what's the tissue comprised of? But like you said, if they're a collegiate athlete, especially at a big Power 5 school, NCAA Division I, there's licensed dietitians, there's meal plans, there's all these things. And then the training, obviously, you're not wanting to put on non-contractile tissue, which is fat. The goal of the strength and conditioning coach, you're going to be wanting to add contractile tissue, which is muscle.
Right.
But, anything else you want to say? You want to move on to the next picture?
The only thing is, like for defense line, we noticed kind of like a plateau, more or less, or maybe a slight increase. So we might be seeing like the high end for athletic defense alignment at most Division I Power 5 programs. Like that might be the high end for maximal body mass. It doesn't have to be a rush end. It could be a nose tackle or, D tackle. So
that's where we kind of talked about putting those smaller, lighter, fast players that can move and cover the field on defense. So, and defensive linemen historically have always been a little smaller than the offensive linemen, but you need those guys to move to be able to chase down ball carriers, make plays in the open field, bat down passes. You need to be agile. So, you just think about it, and it makes sense why the D lineman would trend to be a little smaller historically. So, next one. So let's go to picture 4. So this would be figure 2. So what do you got for us on this figure, Dr. Johnson?
So we're pretty much looking at the rate of change and body mass for our offensive line and defensive alignment, right? So we can see between the decades, so 50s to 60s compared to 60s and 70s, there is an increase for both offensive line, defensive line, their body mass, but maybe not significant. Especially as it relates to rate of change. Then we look at 60s to 70s, 70s to 80s. Pretty similar. The defensive linemen were slimmer though, right? And then we look at, this is where I'm interested, right? The 80s and 90s where it's downhill, it's run, and we see that huge spike, right?
Yeah, so let's pause on this decade and talk about the 80s and 90s. Because you and I both know, if you know your history, so we're both certified strength and conditioning specialists, members of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. And you know that the National Strength and Conditioning Association was founded in, 84, 85? I think it was 1984. So it was founded in the 80s. Going back to Boyd Epley, Nebraska. You think about what was think about Nebraska football in the 80s. If we're going to talk about a Division I school, which is hard for me to do since I'm at KU, but we'll talk about it because this is getting into the history. I mean, Nebraska was at the forefront of strength and conditioning. I mean, big linemen, big, strong, powerful players. I mean, they would just run over everybody.
Right.
So yeah, and you think about it, what came out of that then? People, strength coaches and football coaches start looking around like, well, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Yeah.
In the 80s and 90s. And you see the players just they were big then in the 80s and 90s.
Right. So we see, if you kind of look to the decade before, like the 70s, 80s, and we look at the change over time, like an offensive line, just that rate of change. We could say at the least there's like 10 kilograms on average of mass, like that the offensive line they're carrying on average, right? So imagine on the high end, your biggest, your strongest, your fastest, most powerful offensive line, or all of your starters, right? So again,
and this is really where the science started coming out, how important it was for strength and conditioning training became, there was a lot of awareness of it, and it spread and it became big. Anything else? I mean, is that anything else you want to hammer home?
That's a big point, just there, and then how that kind of ties into, which we'll talk about later, just the speed aspect of the sport. But we also see that after that's kind of the peak, it looks like, right? For the rate of change and the mass for O-line, D-line, and then beyond that, the game changed a little bit, whether it was strategic or from a tactics standpoint. And so now we have a larger offensive line, defensive line, but it looks like it's just not as big as maybe where it was before, based on the speed of the game, the strategy of the game.
Right. And these, again, are rates of change. So it's not absolute, it's the rate. So I think that's important to mention. So I guess maybe we'll go on to, you want to go on to picture 5 then, the figure 3. So this is, again, part of your results for this study. So talk about this this graph.
So yeah, essentially what we see here is an illustration of height for linemen, right? NCAA Division I Power 5 linemen over the decades. So we can see similar trend as with weight. We see here with height, our linemen are getting taller as well. So not only are they getting heavier, but they're also taller.
Right. Makes sense. Especially you look at like on the defensive line, like a defensive end. What coach doesn't love a long, lanky defensive end that can move,
cover ground,
get those arms up,
reach,
get outside and get those sweeps, or even like the little flanker, little screens out to the sideline, and get out there and move horizontally as much as, and also upfield vertically. So it's, I mean, it makes sense that, with the style of play and I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, they're just bigger, faster, stronger, period, at all levels. Not even just the collegiate level. I mean, you're seeing it high school, professional, it's all the way.
Yeah.
And then we'll go on to the next picture. So picture 6 is figure 4 from your results section. So what are we looking at here?
So the big thing that stands out here is with our defensive linemen at this slide, right, for the rate of change. Before it was for the offensive linemen. In the 80s, 90s, those offensive linemen, they weighed more. The rate of change, it was an increase there. Now for the defensive linemen from the 70s to 80s for their height, right, that rate of change really, really sticks out. So we kind of see where we're recruiting taller, longer defensive linemen, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's an emphasis on that pass rush. Maybe there's an emphasis on athleticism at that position where we want.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned that, how these Kinanthropometric measurements influence recruiting. Like the coach says, what body type do I want to go after?
Right.
So I can plug in onto my D line or my O line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a big point there. And then beyond that point, we kind of see the rate of change. It somewhat normalizes between decades, although it decreases, right? Overall, still, our defensive linemen are taller, much taller than they were before.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And a lot of that, too, you think dictated, I'm thinking just offensive plays, a lot of these quarterbacks are getting the ball out in 2.3 seconds.
Right.
So it's like that defensive tackle or defensive end may not have time to get to the quarterback. But if you got that long, lanky body and you get those arms up.
Yeah. Or just being tall, you can affect their vision.
Their vision, yeah.
Just get in their face and.
Because offenses they're trying to get the ball out quick. So it's, everything is sped up.
Right.
So we'll go to picture 7 now, and I know you're really going to like discussing this one. So picture 7, which is figure 5 from your study. So now we're getting into, we've talked about, the athlete's size and how that's changed over the years, their mass and their height. Now let's look at, well, how does that tie into speed, right? So
right,
about this graph.
Yeah, so this ties in the body composition, the shape, the size, into movement, which is important, right, when conducting sports science research, especially for football, right? So
big guys that can move.
Right,
exactly. Move.
Exactly. It's fantastic that you have the mass. It's fantastic that you have the stature. You're tall, but can you move? Are they moving faster? And we see here that between the decades, so it starts at 2000, mainly because that's when NFL Combine data was publicly available, accessible. So that's where we started our analysis. Between 2000 and 2010, our athletes, both offensive line, defensive line, sure, they got faster, not quite significant, but we look at over 20-year period, right, compared to 2000, athletes in the 2020s are significantly faster, whether you're offensive lineman, defensive lineman, in the 40-yard dash.
Yeah.
So these are for me very interesting because it seems like we're watching a new age of the sport, but there's proof, there's evidence that football has progressed into a new age.
And it's amazing how fast some of these larger players are. I mean, I think of Dontari Poe when he played with the Chiefs.
Yeah.
And he played there on the interior of the defensive line. Basically as a he's a defensive tackle, but I think he ran his 40. It was 4.75 seconds, if I remember correctly. It was 4.7, I think, and he was 300 and whatever pounds. I mean, big boy. So again, it's at the collegiate and professional level. Yeah, there's this certain body type that coaches are going to be looking for, but it's like you got to be able to move. Period. Mm-hmm. You think of high school and peewee. It's fine. Yeah, you want that big kid out there at certain positions.
Right.
But as they progress and they go to higher levels, they really need to be able to move, So that's got to be developed by a strength and conditioning coach, by coaches. It's not just about being big, right? So yeah, that chart really, or that graph really graphically displays that. I mean, you think about, defensive linemen and offensive linemen running a 4.9, 5-second 40.
That's scary.
Is moving. Yeah. Yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah. Anything else you want to mention on there?
No, not really. Just kind of ties in again. What you're saying is bigger and they're faster and okay. And I think we'll talk about it next, is just kind of some of those concluding points.
Yeah.
Right, of application. Yeah.
So we'll move into, basically from this study, what conclusions were drawn from this research? What are the practical applications of the study for football players, football coaches, strength and conditioning personnel, and athletic trainers? And we have picture 8, the practical applications pulled up here. I don't know if there's specific things you want to highlight there.
Sure, yeah.
Or just talk about in general.
Sure, just what we've discussed before. Is that our linemen they're bigger, they weigh more, they're taller, and they run faster than they've ever ran, to our knowledge, right? So with that, I think that there's a special place for sports science research to continue to answer some specific questions to the sport related to health and wellness, optimizing athletic performance and long-term athletic development of those athletes, mainly due to the fact that we may be getting close to human potential in regards to stature and to weight and to,
because there is going to be a ceiling we're going to hit. There is going to be a limit. Yeah.
So that's the main thing. Is like, okay, we're getting close to that. Are there any questions like from the field, right, that practitioners have, that the athletes have? Are there any issues that they're facing? And then we kind of look at, all right, so we have that aspect. Then we also have that performance, that momentum aspect. Then we have the safety regulation aspect where, okay, the more mass and the faster it moves, the harder the collision and impact. What's the long-term downstream effect? Yeah.
And that can obviously, like you said, greater impact forces. You think of concussions, you think of, soft tissue, bone injury. I mean, there's just yeah, there's so many things associated with that increased size, the speed, and the momentum that occurs on those impacts. And I like how you have it in here. For instance, a 199-pound player running at a 4.5 second 40 speed can produce approximately 1,600 pounds of force in tackling, easily causing soft tissue and hard tissue damage, right? Just to give an idea of, again, the mass, the velocity, some of those impact forces. I mean, 1,600 pounds of force. Yeah. And it's basically, you're you know how it is. I mean, you are literally like getting in a car accident.
Yeah, sure.
With doing some of these high-speed collisions during a game. So, and depending on the position you play, me as a receiver, it was maybe only 6-7 times a game, depending on how many balls I catch. But these running backs, these linebackers like you played,
right? It's
repeatedly. I mean, you may have 40, 50 collisions a game, so yeah, it's
yeah.
And then I'm trying to think what else I want to talk about. I think we hammered home the injury point. Other practical applications, anything else that you want to mention that we maybe did not discuss?
Other than that is just kind of having like the big picture in mind, or just thinking of the long term for the athlete, the football athlete. I guess specifically for this paper, the offensive lineman, defensive lineman. Sure, maybe they don't run at high velocities, but
compared to the other
positions
compared to the receivers, the cornerbacks, right.
But also they have more mass, they're taller. Okay, so how does that affect? And how can we be as prepared as possible to accommodate that type of athlete? And not only that, hopefully they have a shot to play professionally, but if they don't, how can we assist those athletes in transitioning to life after football, right? To make sure they're healthy and well.
That's a good point you see too, because you look at, especially with offensive linemen and defensive linemen, what I see, you look at a lot of former NFL players and they were massive when they played.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seems like they go one of two directions when they retire, right? You know what I'm getting ready to go into.
Yep.
You see them where they lose a bunch of weight. I mean, they may lose 80, 100 pounds or more.
Yeah.
And they're thin and they look healthy.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, they're probably not at risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and all these other diseases of lifestyle because they've got that weight down. They've taken that weight off, which they needed the weight when they were playing.
Yeah.
Right. But, the more mass you have, it's more work on your heart, more work on, just the different organ systems of your body.
Right.
And, then you see other guys, man, they were 300, 310, 315, 320 when they played, and they blow up even more when they retire.
Yep.
So that's where, the mass and the speed and all that, that's one component when you play. But then, like you said, having a knowledge and understanding of, well, how is that all going to affect your body, especially the mass, like when you retire and as you get older in age as a retired athlete, whether you played in college or professionally, those are things to think about too as you move into your older years.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So it's having that just health conscious mindset, after the playing career is over too.
Exactly.
And I think this happens a lot with football players too. And I can think of guys I played with. I'm not going to say any names out loud, but I can think of some skill position guys I played with, quarterbacks, receivers, running backs that were, man, in great shape when we played. And then now I look at them like, man, you better get your weight and some things under control. Cause but I think what happens is that, you're a high school athlete, college athlete, maybe you played some professionally. It's year-round training, right?
Right.
And so I think they just get burnt out with training, taking care of their body,
Yep.
the nutrition, the diet, everything. And then when they're done playing sports, it's like, I'm just going to do whatever I want. Like, I'm done. I'm retired. It's over. The career's over. But then it's having a negative impact on your health as you age.
Right.
So and I'm sure you can think of guys you played with where you see this happen.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah. Well, I guess the next point, there's only a couple questions left. How do the findings of this study help progress the field of sport and exercise science?
They at least provide like a better understanding. Although it wasn't like all position groups, it was offensive line, but we had to start somewhere. So we at least have a better understanding over the decades of just average, right? Body size, composition, stature, and then we can use this information to kind of guide us forward if we're looking for future trends, right? If we're looking comparatively, like, all right, so what were performance trends back in the 70s, 80s, 90s? Okay, fantastic. How did they develop athletes back in the 70s, 80s, 90s? Which decades are similar? Okay, so from an athlete needs analysis, right? So what were common injuries back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, based on the body stature, size, all those things? And it keeps us proactive at least. We can also guide conversation too, across disciplines, right? So maybe from strength staff to sports medicine to sports coaching staff to sports scientists, we can have a similar talking point.
I just thought of something. Are you seeing any associations with, as the athletes have gotten bigger, with like soft tissue, non-contact injuries? I mean, I don't know with size. I mean, like with offensive and defensive linemen, I'm just thinking of body size and injury rates there with some of the. Now, linemen, the hard part about it, when you're on the interior line, you've got so many bodies falling around you. A lot of times when they blow out a knee, they have an ankle injury. It's just because they're literally engaged, blocking somebody or trying to shed a block.
Right.
And then the lineman next to him falls, a running back gets tackled, and they get rolled up on, and they get that knee or that ankle caught up in the play.
Yeah, so theirs are going to be more contact, but I would say big skill is probably likely going to be a contributor where. And it depends on the system, right? Depends on the coach and the coordinator where larger linebackers, right? Or maybe if you have a fullback in your system or something like a halfback where they're out in space, accelerating, decelerating, accelerating again, and they have to be reactive. That additional mass, if they haven't been trained to handle that mass and decelerate that mass, and
change the direction of that mass,
change the direction of that mass, and it could pose an injury.
Risk. That's where you get those non-contact ACL injuries, and
Yep.
Well, then this kind of leads into, because basically we're talking a player profile here. What is the NCAA D1 lineman, whether they're offensive or defensive? What do they look like? But I think with your future projects, you're kind of looking at doing this for other positions as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe talk about, I guess, some of your future research projects. That's the last question we have to cover.
Okay.
The future research projects related to this topic.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm pretty optimistic that we'll start up some research here with the KU football team, and we can offer some type of assessment of height, weight, and then utilize what the strength coaches have already collected on power, speed, strength, right? And we track that for all athletes over the course of maybe a season, hopefully a career, right? And we're able to utilize that information. And by no means do we want to step on toes. We just want to provide as much information to the practitioner to support the athlete as possible to say, all right, based on our skill set and what we do really well, we can look at the data, we can analyze the data. We have experience in the field working with athletes also, so we can connect there and say, oh, it looks like your offensive lineman, defensive lineman, you all are trending up. You probably knew that. But also let's look at the movement aspect, the strength or the power, the speed aspect, and let's see, is that moving in the right direction? Is that where you want it? Okay, let's work together and come up with maybe other approaches to keep them healthy, keep them training, achieve optimal performance.
Yeah, and then you said you look at it and in talks with the coach, what they're wanting at each position, how each position fits into the offensive strategy or defensive strategy, what they're looking for. And it's like, hey, look, all we're doing as sports scientists, we're giving you data. This is the trends we're seeing at each position, whether it's weight, it's their agility, their lower extremity power, like with the vertical jump, force production, power output, all these different things. Here's what we found. We're just trying to help you as a coach, and how can and this is the trends we're seeing in the data. How can we apply this to athletes at each of these different positions so that your team's more likely to win on Saturdays or Sundays or whatever day they're playing on, Friday night if it's high school.
Exactly, yeah. And also kind of just identifying those optimal heights, weights. So once you get them to a certain weight, these are things that they probably know. We just quantify or validate what they're already doing is, okay, for this system, that's towards the upper limit. We can start to focus on other things,
Have KU football coaches been pretty receptive?
They have. They've been so far.
I know you went over, you've talked to them, you've been working with them some. So.
They've been very receptive, and I'm really excited for future collaboration.
Yeah, we'll have you come back on, bring a coach in and maybe talk. We do something on like in season versus off season training, something like that. So A lot of interesting things we could discuss going forward.
Yeah.
So how can people contact you if they have questions about strength and conditioning, football sports science research, your teaching, anything else that's going on in the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab?
Yeah, the best way to contact me is via email at quincy.johnson@ku.edu. Also, if they're interested, they can call me at 785-864-1944. That's my office phone. So those are the best ways. And then social media as well, whether it be Instagram or X or Twitter, Quincy Johnson, Ph.D. is where they can find me.
Quincy Johnson, Ph.D. Check out his social media account. All right, so I guess I just want to say thanks for coming in, Dr. Johnson, to the show today. And if you have questions for me about the KU Exercise Science program, send an email to jtaylor@ku.edu or call 913-897-8516. I hope you enjoyed this sports science episode of Fitness Facts. Thanks for watching.